for our volunteers. Well, welcome again to Friday Coffee Meetup. We are so pleased to be here with you. We have an exciting speaker, Jim McCarthy. Who knows Jim already? Who has gone to his mastermind before? Nice. He might have an exciting announcement for you later about that. I'll just let him kind of figure that out. So for those of you that don't know him, he was the co-founder and CEO at Goldstar, and now he is the CEO at Stellar Live, helping produce live, great quality events. He has a new book, Beyond the Back Row, and he is also the curator and co-founder of TEDx Broadway, and is on the board of the Pasadena Playhouse. He's been on many other boards, so he is very well known in our community. And I would love to welcome him to the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you can hold questions to the end. We'll do a moderated Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So great to see people from Meetup. Rashad, I didn't get a chance to say hi before you walked in, but anyway, I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you guys before this. Of course, is a legendary Pasadena meetup, and this is my first chance to speak to it. So I'm thrilled about that. But I'm going to start by telling you a story. It's New Year's Eve in 1991. It's my first night in Japan, and I'm overwhelmed, but in a good way. I don't speak the language, and I know really next to nothing about the country, but I've got a job as an English teacher there, and I've never taught English, but I do speak English. And I did graduate with a degree in English a few months earlier, because this is legitimately my first job out of college. And I am on the streets of Kyoto, which is Japan's ancient capital, with my new colleagues. And man, this is really a scene. It is an epic street party. It's the biggest holiday of the whole year. People go to temples and shrines and burn a little incense, say a little prayer for good luck in the coming year, and kind of party, right? Millions of people are on the street. They're talking, they're laughing, eating and drinking and playing pachinko, standing and eating noodles at noodle bars and slurping down ramen. And they're talking on these tiny little phones that we hadn't seen in America yet, which I thought was pretty cool in 1991. And there are people of all ages in this scene. But I noticed something odd. The young people are much taller than the older people. It's really, it seems at least visually to me that the younger people are clearly taller than the older people. And I found out that's actually true. The people my age in 1991 are 4 inches taller than their grandparents on average. And so all of this made me think about my own grandfather, who actually was a little taller than me. So, you know, no generational thing there. But my own grandfather, who came to Japan when he was a young man too, but under a different set of circumstances. He went to Japan to fight World War II. Now, I was young when I got to Japan. I was just out of college, but he was younger. He joined the Navy when he was 13 because it offered him something he couldn't get at home. 3 square meals a day and $5 or $10 to send home to his mother and 12 brothers and sisters every month. For him, believe it or not, fighting a war, even as a young teenager, was a lifestyle upgrade. And the men that he was fighting averaged 5'3" in height. But on the streets of Kyoto in 1991, my contemporaries, the people of my age, were much taller. And they weren't just taller. They seemed to be doing great. They're happy looking, healthy, well-dressed, educated, and they're out for a good time. And I'm thrilled to be there for it. We're not fighting, we're carousing. And that's a big improvement, right? It's just a huge revolution from where we were before. And I'm asking myself, how did we get here? I'm having fun and getting paid to do a pretty cool job instead of spending my teens dodging bullets and bombs. And my new Japanese friends are richer than their grandparents could have imagined possible, working in great companies or studying or doing whatever they want. And they're sharing their New Year's Eve traditions with me, a total stranger to their country. And I'm loving every minute of it. It's great. It's great. So sometime shortly before midnight, several beers in, walking past the overflowing electronic shops, the ramen shops, the pachinko parlors, the karaoke bars, a 3-word phrase pops into my head. Prosperity doesn't suck. I wish that my muse had maybe been a little more delicate about it, but you can't be, picky when it comes to inspiration, I guess. But I want to tell you that these words that literally came into my head as though someone had whispered them in my ear, actually changed my life. They made me think about something I'd never thought about before, and they set me down a certain path in my life. But what I started thinking about is how do we go from the living hell of total war against each other to a street party where everyone was welcome? From death and destruction to prosperity. And how could I, in my life and career, be part of making more of that happen? So pre-war Japan, and this is where I started to put the connections together. Pre-war Japan had leaders that prioritized the domination of Asia. That was their goal. And they made decisions, and then they took actions to try to achieve that goal. And the Japanese people and everybody else around the world paid the price for what those leaders did. Now, in the pre-war American South, which is where my grandfather grew up and my parents too, the leaders prioritized keeping white people on top, right? That was really and truly the priority of their leadership. Even if it meant keeping people in poverty, people like my grandfather and his family, and well, so be it. Even if it meant things like turning a blind eye to things like children joining the military to avoid hunger. And once again, people paid the price for those decisions of the leaders in that time. Now, Japan had transformed since the war, in large part because the leadership committed itself to something else. And broadly speaking, it was the prosperity of their nation. Japanese people could get an education, which they couldn't before. They got better health and nutrition, which is why they got taller. It wasn't a mystery. They got taller because they had better food and nutrition and everything else. They had the freedom to pursue what they wanted to do in life to a far greater degree than they had ever had in the past. Big companies had things like lifetime employment guarantees and housing allowances. And while I'm not here to say how great post-war Japan was or extol its virtues as a system, it was by no means perfect, and there are a lot of things that you could easily criticize. But by comparison, I met a lot of people who grew up in Japan before the war, and then none of them had any nostalgia or any desire to go back to the way things had been. When I got back to the US from Japan a couple years later after working in Japan, my feelings about the link between leadership and the prosperity of a nation or people didn't change. I went into business and then eventually became an entrepreneur because I believed that this was the most direct way for people to create prosperity, and I still believe that. I don't think it means that the government doesn't have a role to play or anything like that. I'm just saying that if you want to find a lever to create prosperity, business and entrepreneurship are certainly one of them. And so when I was first back in the US, I went looking for people, leaders that shared my view of this and went to work for them if I could. And the first one that I found was a man named Noah Alper. Anybody want to guess what company Noah started? Just take a guess based purely on the name. Purely on the name. What's that? Boats. He founded Noah's Bagels. Noah's Arks. There's not a big market for Arks. That's the thing. One worldwide unit of sales so far. But I met Noah, and I was totally hooked on being part of what he was doing. He embodied what I'm here to talk about today. Working for him, I learned what an entrepreneur could do to create this sort of 360-degree prosperity, a very successful business, and to benefit everybody that was involved in that business. He was the first legit agent of prosperity that I ever met. That's what I call it. So I worked for Noah, actually moved to LA as a result of that. Spent several years in high growth businesses and moved into the internet professionally in 1997. And then a few years after that, I started Goldstar with my two best friends. Some of you know it. Some of you know it very, very well. And we grew Goldstar from $1,000 initial investment to more than 100 employees and more than $100 million in annual gross merchandise value. We did that right here in Pasadena. So that's a big one. Very proud of that. Now, over the years, we sold tens of millions of tickets to live entertainment, things like concerts and theater and comedy and sports, stuff like that. We pioneered third-party selling in the live entertainment business and changed the way that people buy and sell tickets. We bootstrapped the company for 13 years. And when we finally did raise money, we got some really interesting reactions. We were in a conversation with a famous VC who was looking at our P&L and our cap table and everything, and he kind of shook his head and he looked at me kind of puzzled, and I was like, this guy has a problem, what's wrong, you know? He looked at me and he said, how did you grow a business this size with so little capital? I don't remember what I actually said in response to that, but here's the answer, having thought about it for these 10 years or whatever it's been. We designed the business to make everybody who touches it better off, to be a prosperity machine. For us, the owners and managers, for the team, for the venues and producers that work with us, and for the industry as a whole. Our goal was never disruption, which is an interesting term. It was well-being. Over time, we did our best to prove that to the people that were involved in our business. We built literally thousands of venue and producer relationships, dozens of key, industry relationships, and millions of customer relationships. We racked up a long list of firsts to serve the industry. We created the first, there's a bunch of things. We created the first customer real-time feedback system in live entertainment. We were the first to use predictive algorithms to target events to customers. We were the first company to sell in an authorized way for Cirque du Soleil. We were the first company to, we became an authorized seller of Major League Baseball tickets without having to spend $50 million a year for the privilege. And we were the first, after a nice round or two or three or four of lawyer letters between me and my friend Sean Moriarty, who was the CEO of Ticketmaster at the time. We were the first authorized third party in history to sell Ticketmaster tickets off the Ticketmaster platform. So one question I asked myself looking back is, how in the world did we do that with almost we didn't have, just the capital to buy these relationships. We did it by trying to make sure that everybody who came in contact with our business was better off because of it, by standing for their prosperity. But maybe we had no choice. We didn't have the resources to be bullies. We didn't have the signed exclusive contracts to squeeze the last dollar out of the people that we worked with. And so maybe that's part of the explanation. But anyway, however it comes to be, that's what we chose to do as leaders of the company, and it worked really well. So I want to talk about leadership. And I want to say in very simple terms how I think about leadership, and then I have a call to action for everybody who's here. Leadership is a pretty big topic, and people sometimes I feel go a little bit overboard with the tactics and techniques of leadership. Those may be important and valuable to learn, but I think about leadership as being essentially three things: aspirations, decisions, and actions. And here's my call to action. We'll come back to that, but here's my call to adventure for you. You're free to refuse it, but here goes. As you grow in your career, as you move along in your own role as a leader, consider the possibility that you could be an agent of prosperity too. That, like Noah and so many other great leaders I've met, your goals could be broader than just serving yourself or maximizing profits. Okay, so hold that thought while we dive into this framework of leadership, and we'll look at it through that lens a little bit. Let's start with aspiration. Leadership starts with what you aspire to do. Remember, we were talking about how the goal of the leadership of pre-war Japan was one thing, and the goal was different after the war. Leadership starts with what you aspire to do. And it sounds kind of obvious, but a lot of times people kind of skip that step and they assume what their aspiration should be. This is your choice as a leader. And for an agent of prosperity, this is a crucial decision. Now, we had a culture of winning at Goldstar. It came from the fact that we got on a really good streak that lasted for about 20 years, and we had ways of doing things that were successful. But within that, we had what we called cultural pillars, things that were important to us. And one of our cultural pillars was based on the old Oakland Raiders motto. Does anyone know? Anyone familiar with this? The Oakland Raiders had a motto, and it was "Just win, baby," which is not really all that great of a motto because, obviously everyone's trying to win. We changed it a little to be just win, 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 baby. So 4 wins, right? The business wins, we as individuals, as part of the team win, our partners win, who are, producing, selling the tickets, and the customers win. That was the goal, those 4 wins. And sometimes as life, the reality of life goes along, things get a little out of balance for one of those constituents, right? Everybody can't always win in the same way all the time. I'll give you an example of this, and this has to do with the aspiration to balance the wins. We went through a period where it became obvious that we, Goldstar, had to raise commissions on the sale of tickets and take more from our venue partners when we sold tickets on their behalf. So, right, we would sell tickets, we take an amount of that as revenue. So we had been really low, really crazy low for a long time. And the business just wasn't making what it should have been making for what we were delivering. And so we had to change it. So we did change it. We changed it confidently in very direct terms, and the partners understood. None of them wanted to pay a higher price, but we explained why it needed to be done. And believe it or not, we got a lot of support. We made it very explicit to them, by the way, that we wanted them to win, but that we actually also had to win too as a business. Now, other times it was our turn to take the hit. And this all speaks to the issue of balancing all the wins and aspiring to make a balance among the wins of the people that are constituents of your business. One year, as many people who run small businesses know, the annual healthcare premium renewal is a moment of terror. It can be, sometimes it's not so bad. Other times you're like, are you kidding me? I can't believe it. So one year, our health insurance premium renewal was an increase of more than 10% on the previous year, which is just crazy, And so we had this longstanding policy of paying 100% of the team's health insurance premiums. But this was just a steep jump, right? This is a big bite. After thinking it over and looking at the big picture, we decided that the company's win in not spending more for healthcare wasn't as important as saving the team members' win in not having to pay out of pocket for insurance that year. So in balancing those wins that I talked about and balancing the 4 wins, we decided to eat the cost and let people know that, we're looking out for their win. We're balancing the wins and creating an engine of prosperity because that's what we had chosen to do as a business. We very, very deliberately and clearly had in our minds that there were interests that we were always balancing in that way, and that we were looking at, and that one of our accountabilities was to look out for the wins of our team, obviously, and that was an example of one where I went in that direction. Okay, so having aspirations is the start, and those aspirations inform your decisions, which is what I was just talking about a little bit. But it's interesting, decisions. Some management theorists actually say that if leaders have a product that they produce, if there's a product that leaders produce, it's decisions. That is the product in the sense of leadership. Decision making is really about just deciding where resources and attention should go, right? Toward this and away from that. And whatever your strategy, whether you want to be an agent of prosperity or not, your decisions really better align with your aspirations, right? If you have aspirations and the decisions don't line up with it, this is how you get, corporate hypocrisy or bullshit, right? Like they say they want to do something, but the decisions just don't reflect it. Whatever the case, whatever your aspirations are, the decisions need to line up with it. So if you want to create a prosperity engine, if you want to be an agent of prosperity, how do you make decisions? Well, there was a period in our business where we competed with a very well-known company, all of you know, who stormed onto the market for discounts several years after we were well established, and they got a lot of attention. They came into the live entertainment space not long after that, directly into competition with us. But what was interesting about it was how good this ended up being for little old Goldstar. The harder this company pushed into the space, the better we looked. They proved that they weren't looking out for the win of the show and production partners again and again. They paid slow. They often demanded exclusivity, and they charged stratospheric commissions. And they hired people who were kind of uninformed, young, inexperienced people. They didn't know the industry, and they really weren't able to be that much help. So these were outcomes in the real world. These were sort of results of the decisions that the other company's leaders had made. Policies on who to hire, how soon to pay, what to charge, what kind of support to provide. Those decisions, by the way, were consistent with their goals. We looked great by comparison. They outspent us and I'm not exaggerating here, 1,000 to 1. But the best, I should say, the highest growth years of our business were during their meteoric rise. Our commitment to the prosperity of the whole ecosystem paid off in a big way. To compensate for their lack of commitment to the same thing, this other company had to spend a lot of money to compete with us. It's a kind of inefficiency if you think about it, right? Okay, so we're talking about aspirations and decisions and how they connect. Aspirations lead to decisions, but decisions don't carry themselves out. To make the decisions actually occur, you take actions. And by actions, I mean all kinds of actions, not just big ones, all day long. It involves conversations and explanations. It involves clarifying and specifying. It involves listening, responding, and adjusting, right? And when you're an agent of prosperity, or when you're trying to be, you make decisions which dynamically balance a lot of different interests in the overall health of the system. And sometimes that means, as we've discussed, that somebody loses. As a leader, you have to take the actions anyway. On many occasions, to take that action, you'll need to take a deep breath and explain this to the person who is in the position to lose something, and to do it without hiding or hedging. And the bigger the issue, the more important this is. Sometimes someone's not going to like the actions you take, but if you've earned their trust, you might be surprised at their reaction. The hardest thing I ever had to do in business was talk to my team on March 13th, 2020, as the pandemic had shut us down and reduced our revenue by 100%. 100. Wasn't hard to do the math on that one. I told our team that our industry basically didn't exist at the moment, and I didn't have any idea when it would be back again, but I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be soon. This would mean that we were facing a brutal immediate future. There was no way we were going to avoid layoffs, furloughs, pay cuts, and tremendous uncertainty. I said that I had no idea how we were going to get through the crisis, but that we were. I had very little good news to offer them. We kept everybody's health insurance active and paid for it, at least for the moment, while we still could. Basically looked them in the eyes and said, we may be paddling over a cliff, but if so, I'm going to be at the front of the boat. You know what? I have never been thanked for comments or a talk to my team more than I was that day. I've never had more people tell me they were inspired and grateful for what I said. I've never had more people tearfully tell me they'd do anything they could to help. They were all in, whatever came next. Can you believe that? We'd stood for their win for a long time, and they remembered that. Being an agent of prosperity means standing for the wins of everybody involved again and again. That's the action part, right? Because when the crisis comes, and it will, you're going to need them to stand for yours. Goldstar did survive the pandemic. We eventually sold the company and spun off our pandemic pivot, Stellar, which is the company, the startup that I'm running today. And I won't dwell on that, but it was in many ways a very hard time, but also on an interpersonal level within the company. It was actually some of the most positive, times that people shared together. In the midst of what you couldn't design something to be more damaging to the live entertainment business than the pandemic was. A long period of being completely shut down, right? But we got through it. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on that, but I just want to say, if you want to be an agent of prosperity, and I hope you do, you'll need to have the right aspirations, make decisions based on those aspirations, and then take actions to see those decisions through every day. But you don't have to. You don't have to be an agent of prosperity. I think you should. I think the world needs you. If you're in this room, you're a leader, and probably you'll be an ever bigger leader as the future in the future. Because leadership matters. I think we'd all agree. Your leadership matters in ways that you might not appreciate. Leadership matters in a million little ways to the people around you, and probably far beyond that. And sometimes leadership is a matter of life and death. I want to take you back to Japan to close the story here, to this little island off the coast of Yamaguchi Prefecture, which is where I live. It's a pretty little place. You can get a ferry from Tokuyama City over to the island. It doesn't take too long. It's a beautiful place to go when the weather's nice. When my grandfather was in Japan, this island was a training base for the Kaiten suicide submarines. A bit like the kamikaze planes, but essentially a torpedo with a steering wheel, right? You get the idea. On this base, they trained young men and boys as young as 16 to pilot these suicide submarines. It is worth pausing here, by the way, for the Americans in the room, to say that it wasn't just Japan that sent children to fight in the war. At least one American child fought in the war too. I'm sure he wasn't alone. My grandfather survived the war, but there's no guarantee of that. He went on to live a long life and raise a family, but it's worth saying that our country is guilty of at least negligence in allowing him to be there. Okay, so just worth saying while we're talking about the suicide submarine program and the kids that were part of it. Anyway, on this island, this base is now a museum, and it's a very powerful experience to go to it. Every man and boy who went through the training had their picture taken, and they wrote a little statement before they were sent out on their mission. And all of these are on the walls and in display cases throughout the museum. Now, many of the messages are just as you'd imagine. They're stoic or patriotic or full of samurai spirit. But the pictures are handsome young faces trying to look brave, to do what their country's asked them to do, what their leaders have asked them to do. But some of the messages were a bit more fearful and mournful of the lives that they were never going to have. One that I remember just said, "I don't want to die yet." The boy in the picture was close to my age then, just a few years younger than I was at the time. I remember feeling this forlorn wish that I could somehow, through that grainy little black and white picture, send a message to him in response to what he wrote and just say, "Don't go." Oh, and maybe meet me in Kyoto in New Year's Eve in 1991, and I will buy the drinks. He wouldn't have been that much older than I am now in 1991. But I could not tell him that. The leadership class, if you want to think of it that way, of the 21st century, especially the entrepreneurial class, is a very interesting opportunity. Humanity is facing a really, what's the right way to put this? The technology that's developing could mean that we face either untold plenty or we could destroy ourselves. Nobody's going to play a bigger role in determining which path we take than leaders of business and the entrepreneurial class of the 21st century, including the people in this room. So if you're up for it, here's my challenge. Aspire to be an agent of prosperity, make decisions with the well-being of the whole in mind, and take the actions you need to take, even when they're hard, to make the world the way you want it to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for encouraging us to be agents of prosperity. We are going to do some Q&A now. Jim has told us an amazing story. We're going to ask that you not tell me stories right now, but Jim will stick around after. So if you have a question, make sure it's concise and ends with a question mark. Thank you so much.
So, yeah, what am I doing? Okay. I'm holding this and then right. Okay, gotcha.
Thank you very much, Jim. It was a great talk. I think I would be remiss if I did not mention, besides you being an entrepreneur, you're also a father, and that your daughter is here today. Would you like to say her name is Elizabeth? So I'm thinking very proud of the company you got. My wife too. I wasn't introducing her earlier, so I was giving her some other thought. But let's see, if I didn't have, that's a very good one.
I have questions. Japan, unlike other countries in Asia, has been known for really invest and energy on the e-commerce. Was that affect your business? And if you have any suggestions? I'm not sure I understand the question. Yeah. interest on like using like e-commerce or IT technology, the apps like than other Asian countries that are being known for many business work. Does that affect your business? Or how do you feel about how to overcome that, like the comparison with US?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on modern Japanese tech. I'm not an expert on modern Japanese e-commerce, really. I do, have some friends and business colleagues there. I think Japan is going to forge its own path. I mean, in some ways, very, very high tech, and in other ways, it's not. I haven't got a great answer to that question, to be honest with you. I wish I knew more.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your words of wisdom. It's amazing. I've worked with many good leaders and some not so great leaders. As far as, I can imagine that discussion on March 13th, as you mentioned, but the trust that you built with your team must have been amazing. My question has to do with, it sounds like you made a lot of really great moves, really great decisions, but what about bad decisions and even mistakes? And how important is it as a leader to own up to your mistakes and to also communicate those mistakes in a transparent way? And how does that also lead to building trust with your team?
I think you kind of just said it. I mean, you have to, I think one of the best practices, I don't know where I picked this up, but there was a company that did this so well that it actually became something that we did. So oftentimes we would start a project, like a new initiative or maybe a new product line or something like that. And sometimes it just didn't work, but we would, I'm sure everyone's been in companies where when you start something new, there's a lot of fanfare about it, right? There's presentations, and we're like, yeah, it's going to be cool, is it? And then the thing sort of doesn't work, and you never hear about it again. And I understand that, because who wants to stand there and say, well, this sucked, and look at this, didn't work, and that wasn't good. But I wish that I could remember and credit the CEO who said, like, one of the things we do is we debrief. We deliberately shut things down when they don't work, and then we debrief everybody in the same measure that we announced it. We're just as visible with, hey, look, here's what happened, here's why we're not doing it anymore, and here's why we're shutting it down. We do an equal amount of telling that story, and I thought, well, that's brilliant, right? So we actually made a practice of that. So I'll give you an example. We created this ticket lottery functionality. And this is at a time when this was kind of really popular in New York City. For hot tickets, they would do a digital lottery at a certain price, right? If you get a really, really awesome price, but you had to enter a lottery, and then some people would win and they'd have the ability to buy a ticket. So we kind of thought about like what our spin on that would be, and we got very excited about it. We built a product, and it just never really worked out. You know what I mean? We gave it, 6 months of good, solid effort. And then we wound it down, and we had a presentation. Like, okay, let me show you the numbers, and here's what we did, and here's why. And now we're not going to do it anymore. And so that was the first example of where we would very consciously say, remember that thing we told you about? It didn't work out, but the alternative is either you just pretend it didn't happen, which is a very attractive option, frankly. But or you sort of you just pretend it's fine or whatever. But actually, the worst option is keep doing it even though it doesn't make sense because you don't want to face it, right? But obviously, the best thing to do is to say to people, here's why we arrived at the decision that we need to stop doing that. And again, it's hard for people to argue with just solid logic on stuff like that, right? And they also feel, I think, a sense of appreciation for being straightforwardly told why things are happening. So I think it hit on something very valuable there. I really wish that I could remember who sort of showed that process or that practice to me, but we adopted it after that.
There's a question back here.
Yes.
Yes, hi. Thank you. Do you think that the NFTs have a fun livestreaming event it's involved?
I think someone's going to figure that out. I mean, I think NFTs to me, and I'm not an expert, but I know I understand what they are. I think as long as there's purpose and value in an NFT, there could be an application. I mean, I think mostly right now, with exceptions, it's a solution to the problem. But I think sometimes it takes years for people to find the right. I mean, here's an example: QR codes. How long were QR codes totally useless before all of a sudden people found an application for them, right? So it's not to say that it's dumb. But I do think it's we know we can do it. Okay. What are you going to do? That's where I think NFTs are right now. But I do think there's an application somewhere in the live world. No one's really nailed it yet, in my opinion. Yeah.
So sorry. Turn the video back on. I turned it off and I'm going to turn it towards you. So.
Yeah.
Question is when something doesn't work, how do you, because we work in advertising and we're doing A/B test or A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J.
Okay.
I'll tell you what, you.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, was another situation, another product where it didn't work, but you were like, well, let's pivot. Like how long, because I work with clients a lot and they'll, unless they see perfection at the beginning, they're like, wow, it's not gonna work. So I guess the question is.
Wait, okay, yeah, what's the question?
The question is, when you see something not working, how long would you give it to
Yeah.
pivot, to change, to go back to the job, to say, okay, we know that there's something here. We're not going to give up on it. We're going to keep pivoting, even if out of the gate it's not a success.
That I don't think there's any way to be precise about that, but with each move that you make, you should be learning something, right? So if you're learning something, you can make a good informed next step. When you run out of good informed next steps, maybe that's a way to think about it, right? Or when everything you're learning is like, you know what, there's less here than we thought, right? So think of it as what are you taking what you have learned from the things that you've done so far, what do you know now? And when what you know now sort of like the balance tips toward like maybe this isn't a good idea, maybe that's the time, right? Yeah. I don't think there's any precise way to do that. Yeah, it's not a bad way to think about it. All right.
So I like what you said on the 4 wins.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's and actually I'll ask you, what do you think about the role of trust in that? With trust with the people that you're working with, trust with your clients, trust with all of it. I feel like that's important, but I'm not sure if there's a balance or a way to balance or tact or understanding.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's sort of a vague question, so you can go anyway.
I mean, trust has to be earned, right? So I think that the effect of living it for a period of time gives the trust, creates the you know what I mean? So I mean, I think if you stand for somebody's success for long enough, eventually they're going to trust you, or that they don't already. I mean, there's always, I think if you think about starting with the relationship between a company and an employee, there's a certain amount of trust that you have to have just to go to work for a company, right? A certain amount of trust. And then the company either earns more or less as time goes on based on what happens, right? And the same thing, reciprocally as well, right? If you hire somebody that you don't trust, doesn't make any sense. So an employee either earns more or less trust. Business partner, same thing. If you become a partner with somebody, you start with some amount of at least willingness to take a risk that the person is trustworthy, and then you learn more about whether that's true as time goes on. So if you have these beneficial relationships where people are kind of looking out for each other in that way, then it tends to add more to the trust account, And then if they don't, then it depletes it, And I also think just constant communication adds a lot as well when it comes to that, right? If you're talking constantly about what you want, what you're trying to do, it matters a lot. But it's a huge topic, yeah. I mean, you can't really do. There's so much. If you think about it, there's so much you can't do in the absence of trust. Like one of the things about, for example, blockchain is the desire to take trust out of the equation. But I think we've seen that you can't really take trust out of the equation, and when you do, it doesn't matter how good your record keeping is. It can still collapse, right? Like, so you're right. Trust
And there's a book whose title is escaping me on the subject, but I think it's great. It's one of these things that no matter what happens in terms of technology or whatever, as long as we're still human beings, we're going to rely on it. In that way. Absolutely. Oh yeah.
Given your perhaps unusual views on leadership and a black belt in Kung Fu, what do you look for in employees and what are some of your favorite interview questions? Eat that out.
You know, I'm one of these people who I don't think of myself as a great interviewer. I know people like, yeah, I'm a great interviewer. I'm like, oh, you know, and I think part of the reason that I'm not a great interviewer is because I want to see good, you know, I want to see like, okay, and I know that about myself, right? So I tend to kind of overrate people if I interview them. By the way, this is true across the board, and it's true in ways that are not always great, right? Like people tend to overrate people in interviews based on some not so wonderful things. Valerie is shaking her head because she knows this very, very well. Nodding her head, I should say, because she knows this very well. Like, you know, hey, it helps to be good looking if you want to succeed in an interview, for example, right? That's not a pretty fact to know, right? Like it helps to be a similar age or ethnicity or whatever to the person that interviewed. These are not good things, right? So for the most part, I think of interviews as being not very important. You know, the thing that I think it's just not that. And what's worse about it is that, especially when you get to be a leader and people hold you in esteem or whatever, you start to think that your judgment is good on everything. And the truth is, you know, probably not special when it comes to interviewing skill. You know what I mean? I'm not. You know, I really know that I'm not, right? What I have found about hiring is if you there's a couple of things. One is if the person has done the same job or a similar job, or it's just a little bit of a stretch, and they've done it well in the past, they'll probably do it well in that role. And secondly, if they actually have specific interest in the company and the mission of the company, that really helps too. You know, there's some ways to avoid making bad hires like 90% of the time. And none of them is interviewing. You know, I mean, you know, we over the years started to emphasize interviewing less and less because what we would get is just these wild, you know, just carousels of people's opinions about things that they're just making stuff up. I mean, I'm not kidding. Like people would say, well, I just felt somehow that they blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, where did you get that from? You know what I mean? Like we're just making, it's this narrative making ability that we have as human beings. Like Nicole, you know, making narratives. Weren't we talking about that the other day? Yeah. Well, we'd see one little thing or hear one little thing, and then we create a whole thing, a whole backstory about why that's the defining characteristic of the person, you know. And I don't think it's true. So I wouldn't actually answer that question skillfully because I don't see myself as a great interviewer. But on the other hand, I see interviews as being a lot less valuable than many people think. It's really more of like, I think of interviews as being something where you're trying to find out if, you know, are you just going to hate this person? You know, are they an unbearable jerk or is it just bad chemistry or something like that? That's kind of maybe all, I don't know. Again, this is not the definitive, you know, how to do interviews, but I guess the only thing I've ever done in terms of interview questions that I thought was useful was tell me a story about a time when you did X and ask them to sort of narrate a real life example of something that they're probably going to be doing in the job. Oftentimes you find that people haven't actually done the thing before that they need to be doing. And if they can't tell you a story about when they did it, a similar thing, you probably don't have a lot of knowledge about it. That's my one actual interview question. Tip. I don't know if that helps. Yeah. Oh, Farshad. That's going to be a tough one. Oh, God. This guy's tough.
Thank you for the nice talk.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming.
So, I'm just wondering, there's 4 ways that you have in balancing it out. Is it fair to say that you have the luxury of balancing them out because you bootstrapped the company for so long and you didn't have somebody looking?
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think the more, yeah, I mean, or if we didn't, then we need to have somebody else who bought into that framework of belief, right? But yeah, it's a big argument in favor of independent businesses. Yeah, 100%. Of course, Farshad says an extremely insightful thing. It's absolutely true. If you start from the point of view of like, hey, the explicit goal is X number of dollars or something like that, then then all of a sudden that's in the aspiration part, right? So all the rest of it's downstream of aspirations, and it gets more challenging. So yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one last question.
Okay.
Taking back to the beginning of Goldstar, we talked about wanting to be an entrepreneur after you return from Japan.
Mm-hmm.
You told us the call to action is to be an agent of prosperity. How did you guys, or how did you talk a little bit about your partners? How did you guys come together to come up with this idea of Goldstar, launch this company? Because entrepreneurs are very risky, and developing these leadership skills, a lot of it is like trial and error.
Yeah.
To kind of try to figure it out on your own as we go along. Can you kind of talk about that whole process?
Sure. Well, the story. Okay, so I worked with one of the two other co-founders at GeoCities, which is many of you remember GeoCities, and then the other I went to business school with, and then we all three worked at another startup in 1999, and we drove to Long Beach every day to work there. So we had long commutes. This is true. We had long commutes together every day from Pasadena to Long Beach, and talked about all kinds of things. And then in the course of that, we basically planned Goldstar. Actually, we started with saying like one day we're going to start our own thing, like for we're gonna, and then the day came finally. So there was a lot of talking through what we were looking to do, and we were already friends, and we were working we'd worked on things together, but we spent a lot of time in the car talking about and really taking lessons from what we were doing in the startup, and a lot of it was like, well, let's not do like all the things that this startup that we're in is doing. Let's not do those things. Let's do the opposite of that. So yeah, it was really a question of starting really slow, and figuring out what the business was over the course of a couple of years. That was painful, but it made it easier to do it right.
And a quick follow-up to that question. What would you say was the most instrumental in helping you develop your leadership skills? Because it didn't sound like, the three of you guys had a lot of that, but eventually you guys came up with a value system and came up with a 4-win philosophy, and eventually the company, I think, became successful because of all that.
Well, we all of us had good experience in high growth companies and on the internet and stuff like that. So we did have a lot of the fundamentals. But I don't know. That's a good question. What was it? What was the most instrumental part of it? Oh, I think it was the fact that we lived with the result every day. There wasn't a lot of there weren't a lot of buffers or cushions for us, and we were very, very result oriented in the sense that we built ourselves a screen where we could see what was happening in our business every single day, and so there was easy to make a direct connection between what we did and what happened as a result. And then as more people were part of the business, we very quickly came to understand that we needed people to want to be there and to be successful and not to leave, and all the partnerships that we built, we completely relied on. So we were in a business where, we were selling tickets on behalf of people who were making shows. So if they didn't want to work with us, they didn't have to, so we had to be successful for them. So it was really a lot of like rapid feedback from cause and effect, and being just right at the heart of it from the start. So I think that helps a lot, as opposed to being, at a remove from things. So, it's quick, it's easy to learn.
Do you have a certain app or technology you like to be able to see the business at a glance?
No, I wouldn't. There's nothing that I would say like, oh, just download, such and such. No, in the original, version of Goldstar, we built it. Nothing like that existed in 2002. And it was modified a zillion times over the years. These days, there's a lot of ready-made solutions for that. And what's interesting about it is that they are all excellent, but they also are hard to actually make it do what you want it to do. So the fact that we didn't have those ready-made solutions to turn to meant that what we did have was perfect for us, and so I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm just saying, that there's a plus and minus to all this ready-made stuff, Zendesk and these other solutions for all these things, right? Like sometimes they're good, and they're like, that's really impressive, and you can download it and configure it, and you're off to the races. But a lot of times, I've seen companies that, in 2023, don't have anywhere near as much information on an e-commerce management basis than we had in 2003 that we built ourselves. Because it's just not what, you have to build an app that works for a large number of people. And so some stuff is just not custom. So it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off.
Thank you to everyone on LinkedIn Live. I'm going to turn that over.